welcome to the Women's Health theme. Today we're going to be talking about the menstrual cycle. So before we begin, just a few questions to test your previous knowledge. So, question 1. The luteal phase of the ovarian cycle corresponds to which phase of the uterine cycle? So A, the secretory phase, B, the menstrual phase, or C, the proliferative phase? So think about what happens during each of these phases and which one links. So the answer is A, the secretory phase. Question 2. What is the main hormone produced by the corpus luteum? Is it A, LH, B, FSH, C, progesterone, or D, estrogen? So think about the hormones, their functions, and which is the most useful after releasing the ovum. So the answer is C, progesterone. And question 3. Which cells produce FSH? Is it A, granulosa cells, B, gonadotropic cells, C, theca cells? And think about where these cells are in the body and where FSH is made, and that might help you out. So the answer is gonadotropic cells. So, the menstrual cycle. We're going to talk about what is the menstrual cycle, signs and symptoms of the menstrual cycle, and what premenstrual syndrome is. The menstrual cycle hormones, the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle, and then we're going to finish off by asking a few more questions to test your understanding. So, what is the menstrual cycle? So the menstrual cycle is a series of natural changes that occur in a woman's reproductive system. The average cycle lasts 28 days, with ovulation occurring at day 14. So the average age for a woman's first menstrual bleed, so menarche, is between 12 and 13 years old. The menstrual cycle is controlled by the endocrine system via the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and the gonads. And the menstrual cycle can be looked at as the ovarian cycle, so the cycle of the ovum, and the uterine cycle, so the changes in the lining of the uterus. And a woman is most fertile 5 days before ovulation and 1 to 2 days after ovulation. So this is a little picture to show you the endocrine control system of the menstrual cycle. So an overview of the menstrual cycle. So this is a really nice picture, like summary diagram of the menstrual cycle, and if you learn that, you'll probably be okay for your exams. But we'll go through it in a little bit more detail and talk through the different hormones and the differences between the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle now. So signs and symptoms. So before we go through the hormones and exactly what they do, there's something called premenstrual syndrome, or PMS, which refers to the physical and emotional symptoms a woman experiences in the 5 to 10 days before her period. So some of those symptoms are like acne, breast swelling and tenderness, fatigue, difficulty sleeping, abdominal cramps, and they're normally in the first day of the period or the day before period. Changes in appetite, bloating, constipation or diarrhea, headaches, mood swings, irritability, feeling anxious or upset. And each woman will experience different signs and symptoms at different points in the cycle. So the hormones. So GnRH, so gonadotropic releasing hormone, is released by neurons in the hypothalamus. So high estrogen levels inhibit GnRH release and low levels stimulate it, and it acts on the anterior pituitary. So it acts on the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH. So FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. So it's produced by the gonadotropic cells in the anterior pituitary gland, which stimulates the growth of the immature follicles in the ovaries to acts on the granulosa cells that surround the egg to produce estrogen. So it's stimulated by GnRH and inhibited by estrogen. And then we have LH is also released when the GnRH is produced. So it's produced and secreted by the gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. It's inhibited by low levels of estrogen and stimulated by higher levels of estrogen. So a surge in LH triggers ovulation and supports an increase in estrogen binding to the theca cells. So if you go back to that diagram that we had, there's an LH surge in the middle of the diagram on day 14, and that causes the release of the egg. So the theca cells form part of the ovarian follicle, and the granulosa cells surround it. So theca cells in the middle, and then granulosa cells around it. Theca cells produce androgens, and granulosa cells will use these androgens to produce estradiol, and after ovulation, the granulosa cells produce progesterone. So then we have estrogen, and then estradiol is the main form in females. So it's a steroid hormone, so it can diffuse across the cell membrane, and it uses estrogen receptors inside the cells. It's produced primarily by granulosa cells of the ovarian follicles, which are stimulated by FSH. and it promotes female secondary sexual characteristics and endometrial growth. And then we have progesterone as well. So that's another steroid hormone. It's produced mainly by the corpus luteum in the ovary. It has a synergistic effect with estrogen. So it's the hormone of pregnancy, so to speak. It promotes endometrial development and thickens the vaginal epithelium and cervical mucus, so sperm cannot enter the uterus, and it inhibits lactation until after birth. So let's go through the ovarian cycle now. So this picture nicely demonstrates the changes in the ovaries as the ovarian cycle progresses. So the ovarian cycle can be split into the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. So the follicular phase, so there's a steady increase in FSH, which causes stimulation to the ovarian follicles. So when a follicle is matured, it produces large amounts of estrogen to inhibit the other follicles from maturing. So the mature follicle is known as the tertiary or the gonadal follicle. Estrogen causes endometrial thickening. So the follicles FSH rise, stimulates the follicles to produce estrogen. Estrogen causes endometrial thickening and inhibits LH. Once estrogen reaches a certain level, that then causes a surge of LH around day 12. So then ovulation can occur around day 14. LH causes the tertiary follicle to become thinner so that it ruptures and releases a secondary oocyte. So that's what's happening over here in this diagram. This is called ovulation. This then matures into an ovum, which is then released into the fallopian tube. So then after that phase, there's then the luteal phase. So the primary pituitary hormones, LH and FSH, cause the remaining part of the tertiary follicle to develop into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then produces progesterone, which maintains the endometrium and inhibits the production of estrogen and inhibits the production of LH and FSH. So the inhibition of LH and FSH mean that the corpus luteum atrophies and progesterone is no longer produced. So this fall in progesterone causes the endometrium lining to shed so that menstrual bleeding occurs. Corpus luteum is then broken down and forms the corpus albicans. But if the ovum is fertilized, then the outer layer, the syncytial trophoblast, becomes part of the placenta, and these cells produce HCG, which is similar to LH, and this preserves the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum continues producing progesterone, so the levels don't drop, so the menstrual bleeding doesn't occur. And that's all to do with how pregnancy is maintained. But that's not what we're talking about at the moment. And then we have the uterine cycle. So the uterine cycle has 3 phases: proliferative, secretory, and menstrual phases. So the proliferative phase corresponds to the second half of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. Endometrium is repaired and it grows due to the rising levels of estrogen, ready to accept that hopefully fertilized ovum. So the secretory phase. This phase begins once ovulation has occurred. So progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum to maintain the endometrium and causes secretions from the endometrial glands to prepare the uterus for embryo implantation. And then we have the menstrual phase, so it corresponds to the first half of the follicular phase. It occurs if no implantation occurs, there's loss of the corpus luteum, which causes a decrease in progesterone, so the functional endometrium sheds. So what I just said is a lot of different phases and different fancy words, but if we go back to the first diagram that I showed you, it's quite nicely mapped out. So you just need to know what hormones surge at what point, which causes what in the uterus and in the ovary, and then add in the different levels and different terms and phases and like stage names. It becomes a lot easier once you get your head around the different hormone changes, I promise. So in summary, I know that I did just talk quite a lot and quite fast. What have you learned? So question 1, which hormone has a synergistic effect with estrogen? So A, LH, B, GnRH, C, FSH, or D, progesterone? So can you think back to what I've just said about the functions of each different hormone? The answer is progesterone. Question 2, which cells produce FSH? So A, granulosa cells, B, theca cells, C, gonadotropic cells. And can you remember the function of each of these cells? I did go through them. It's C, gonadotropic cells. So the GnRH released from the hypothalamus then acts on the gonadotropic cells in the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH, if you remember. And finally, question 3, a decrease in what hormone is responsible for menstrual bleeding? Is it A, progesterone, B, estrogen, C, LH, or D, FSH? Can you remember exactly what each of these hormones does? So the answer is progesterone. So progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum to maintain the endometrial lining ready for the fertilized ovum implantation. So when there is no longer a corpus luteum, the progesterone levels decrease so that the endometrial lining sheds, and that's what causes your period, or the menses, as it's otherwise known. So thank you very much for watching today. I hope you've learned something. I know it's quite complicated. The menstrual cycle can be quite complicated or overcomplicated, but when you break it down into what hormone increases or decreases at what point, it does become quite simple, and then add all the different cycles and phases and definitions in, and it does become a lot more understandable and manageable. You can learn about it, I do promise that. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you've learned something today.